Go and destroy the world!
The morning sun rose over the Valley of Elah, casting long shadows across the rolling hills. The air was heavy, not only with the heat of the day, but with the weight of dread that hung over the Israelite camp. Across the valley, banners of Philistines rippled in the wind, a sea of warriors waiting for one man to step forward. And then he appeared. A figure emerged from the ranks of the Philistines, each step pressing deep into the soil as though the earth itself felt his burden. He was no ordinary man. He was a towering presence, wrapped in bronze that glimmered like fire under the sun. His spear alone seemed like a tree stripped of its branches, its iron tip heavier than most men could lift. His helmet flashed, his shield bearer walked ahead, and his roar rolled like thunder across the valley. This was Goliath of Gath, the giant. The ground seemed to tremble beneath him. To the Philistines, he was their champion. To the Israelites, he was terror-given flesh. His very size was a weapon, a reminder that not all men are born equal. For 40 days he had risen from his camp, shouting across the valley, daring any Israelite to meet him in single combat. Each day his challenge echoed, and each day silence followed. No man stepped forward. Soldiers who had faced blades without flinching, who had marched into battle with courage, shrank like children before him. Even King Saul, taller than all his men, kept his silence. What man could fight such a beast? Goliath was over 9 feet tall, his body covered in plates of bronze that shimmered like dragon scales. His voice cut through the air like a blade. To meet him was not just to risk death, but to face the impossible. The valley became a prison of fear, yet fear like fire draws the eye. The story of Goliath was not simply the tale of a giant standing tall. It was a tale of what he represented. His shadow stretched beyond the battlefield. He carried within him the memory of an older world, when giants were said to roam freely upon the earth. Stories whispered of the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Nephilim, beings of vast size who were more than human. Some believed Goliath carried their blood. Others thought he was a man simply blessed or cursed by nature with unnatural size. Whatever the truth, he was an embodiment of power beyond reason. And across from him stood a boy, not yet on the battlefield, not yet a warrior, not even counted among the soldiers. A shepherd, whose hands had guided sheep across hills, whose sling had sent stones fly at wolves and bears, but who had never stood before an army. He was young, untrained, overlooked. To most, he was nothing but a boy with a harp, a helper who carried bread and grain to his brothers. Yet what stirred within him was something the giant could never carry. Faith. The kind of faith that looks at mountains and sees them fall, that looks at storms and believes they will break. Faith that measures not by size of the enemy, but by the strength of what cannot be seen. This was David. The two figures, one vast, armored, roaring, the other small, unarmed, quiet, were destined to meet. Yet destiny does not arrive in an instant. It builds in whispers, in the fear of soldiers, in the challenge of the giant, in the courage growing inside a boy. The valley became more than ground for war. It became a stage where two worlds would collide, the world of flesh and strength and the world of faith and courage. Day after day, Goliath roared his challenge. His words mocked the Israelites, mocked their God, mocked their courage. He called them slaves, cowards, shadows hiding behind shields. Each word was a hammer against their hearts. And still, none answered. Each day the silence gave him more power. Each day the soldiers shrank deeper into despair. Imagine the sound of his footsteps as he advanced into the open field. The creak of bronze plates rubbing together. The heavy thud of his spear striking the earth as he leaned upon it. His laughter when no one rose to meet him. It was as though he was not only fighting a battle, but weaving a spell of fear that bound an entire nation. But giants, for all their size, often failed to see the smallest things. In the hills, David's life was far from the battlefield. He had watched over sheep through nights thick with wolves. He had chased off lions that leapt from the shadows. He had felt fear, but fear had never ruled him. His sling was not just a tool, but an extension of his hand. The stone, once loosed, never missed its mark. Yet David never thought of himself as mighty. His strength was not his own. It was drawn from the one he trusted above all. He did not know that his journey from shepherd to battlefield would be written into history. He did not know that one day, the shadow of a giant would stretch across his path, demanding an answer. But stories have a way of placing the unlikely in the heart of destiny. As the soldiers of Israel sat in despair, as the Philistines laughed in scorn, the shadow of Goliath loomed larger with each passing hour. His name was carried like a curse across the valley. Mothers whispered it in fear. Fathers trembled at the thought of facing him. Children learned that not all monsters live in dreams. And still he roared, his voice shaking the very air. This was no ordinary fight. This was more than war between nations. This was the ancient battle. Man against giant. Courage against fear. The small against the mighty. The kind of battle that does not die with time, but echoes forever in story and legend. The ground itself seemed to wait. For in every age, giants rise. They rise in the form of men larger than life, in challenges that seem unbreakable, in fears that tower over the human heart. And in every age, someone must step forward to face them. In the Valley of Elah, that moment was drawing near. The shadow of Goliath stretched long, dark, and unbroken. Yet from the hills, unseen and unknown, a shepherd was already walking toward his fate. A boy who would carry no sword, no shield, no armor, but something far greater. The name Goliath is remembered as a giant who fell to a shepherd's stone, but his story did not begin on that battlefield. His shadow stretched back into an age when the line between history and myth blurred, when stories of giants filled the world like echoes of forgotten time. To understand Goliath, one must go beyond the clash of armies and listen to the whispers of his origin, for he was not seen as an ordinary man. The Philistines called him their champion. He was a warrior they trusted to face nations alone, a figure who seemed born for the battlefield. But to the Israelites and their allies, he was more than a soldier. He was terror given form, a nightmare that walked beneath the sun. His size, his power, and his presence all raised the same question. What was he truly? Some claimed he was descended from the Rephaim, a race of giants whose names were written in ancient scrolls and spoken of in fearful tones. The Rephaim were said to be taller than towers, their strength beyond mortal measure. Their origin was cloaked in mystery. Yet many believed they were remnants of something far older than mankind itself. Whispers told of days when strange beings walked among men, when heavenly and earthly bloodlines mixed. Out of that mingling came giants, creatures too great to be contained by the earth, beings that carried both human hunger and unnatural might. The Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim, names passed down through generations, each one speaking of shadows that once ruled the high places of the world. To the Philistines, Goliath was proof that such a bloodline still survived. He was their living tower, their wall of flesh and bronze. His armor gleamed brighter than the sun, his spear heavier than a plow. He was not only a man of war, he was their legend made flesh. When he stepped onto the field, he carried with him not only his own strength, but the pride of a people who believed the blood of giants still ran in his veins. But to others, his very existence raised deeper fears. Could such a creature truly be mortal? Could he be the last fragment of an age when men and giants walked side by side? The Israelites looked at him and remembered the warnings of old. The stories of tribes too powerful to fight, of lands where grapes grew as large as fists, of enemies whose very height filled men with dread. Goliath stood before them, as if those warnings had risen from the dust. No man is born a giant without whispers. From his youth, Goliath must have been marked as different. Imagine a child already towering over his elders, his footsteps heavy, his fists like stones. Perhaps mothers hushed their children when he passed, for his size alone set him apart. Perhaps fathers avoided his gaze, but they saw in him not just a boy, but a prophecy, a reminder of what once lived in the earth. He grew not only in body, but in reputation. Each year, he became more than a man. By the time he reached the battlefield, he was already a story, and stories are far more dangerous than swords. The Philistines shaped him into their weapon. They clothed him in bronze. They placed a spear in his hand that few others could lift, and they sent him forth as a symbol. His very presence was a challenge. To face him was to fight against the impossible. And so he became what they needed him to be, their giant, their invincible champion. Yet the mystery of his bloodline lingered. Ancient writings described the Philistine cities of Gath, Ashdod, and Gaza as places where giants were said to dwell. Goliath's own brothers were described as men of great size, their spears as massive as his. This was no single miracle of birth. It was a family, a lineage, a line of warriors whose origins stretched back to times few could remember. Some said they were the last sons of the Anakim, driven into the Philistine lands when Israel had taken Canaan. Others whispered darker tales, that the blood of the Nephilim still pulsed within them. But the more mysterious the story, the more powerful the legend. The Israelites did not merely see a man before them. They saw the return of something their ancestors had feared. They remember how their forefathers trembled when spies reported, "We saw a giant in the land, and we were like grasshoppers in their sight." Goliath was that vision made real. He was a walking reminder that the earth had once been ruled by beings too large for men to conquer. And so the question has always remained, was Goliath a man blessed with unnatural size, or was he the last son of a forgotten race? The mystery deepens when we look beyond his body to his strength. A man's muscles may grow large, but what gave him the voice that silenced armies? What gave him the courage to walk alone into the valley and mock an entire nation? Perhaps he carried within him more than the pride of the Philistines. Perhaps he bore the echo of an ancient arrogance, the same pride that giants of old carry when they rule without fear. Every legend is shaped not only by what a man does, but by what others believe about him. Goliath's story was built long before David ever faced him. To his people, he was proof of their power. To his enemies, he was a return of their darkest fears. And to history, he became a question that has never been fully answered. The world has always been haunted by giants. From the Titans of Greece to the Jotun of Norse lands, from the Fomorians of Ireland to the colossal beings of the Bible, nearly every culture has remembered them. How could so many distant peoples carry the same memory? Were they all imagining the same thing, or were they echoing a truth that once walked among them? Goliath was not just a man. He was a window into that mystery. His legend carries us backward into those ancient tales, forcing us to wonder whether giants truly walked the earth. The bones unearthed in caves, the massive weapons buried in forgotten soil, the stones of ruins too large for ordinary men to lift. All these keep the question alive. And at the center of it all stands Goliath, a figure whose story refuses to fade. The shepherd's stone may have ended his life, but it did not end his mystery. His name continues to stand as a symbol of the impossible, a reminder of a race that once cast shadows over the world. The birth of his legend was not the moment he stepped onto the battlefield. It began long before, in the whispers of bloodlines, in the fear of nations, in the stories of beings too large to be forgotten. Goliath was not simply a warrior. He was the last echo of a time when giants ruled, a time when the line between men and myths was still thin. And though his fall is remembered as a triumph of the small over the mighty, his rise is a story just as powerful. For in his rise, we see the survival of ancient memory, the persistence of old fears, and the proof that legends never truly die. Even now, thousands of years later, the name Goliath is spoken as if he still lives, as if his shadow has never left the earth. He is remembered not just for his defeat, but for what he was believed to be, the last child of giants, the nightmare of nations, the mystery that still stands taller than the men who fought him. And so his legend was born, not in victory or defeat, but in the very question he leaves behind. Were giants, and were they ever truly gone? The Valley of Elah was a place of rolling hills and scattered streams, where the soil was rich and the trees bent in the wind. But during those 40 days, it became something else. It became a stage where fear itself ruled, where courage withered, and where a single man, if he could even be called only a man, turned an entire nation into trembling shadows. Every morning, as the sun rose and burned away the mist, the Philistine champion emerged. The ground seemed to groan beneath his steps. Bronze armor gleamed upon his shoulders, the weight of it enough to crush lesser men. His spear was like the trunk of a tree, his shield bearer no more than a servant walking before him. And when he stopped in the open field, silence fell across both camps. Then his voice came. It rolled across the hills like thunder, deep and unshakable, reaching even the furthest tents. He called out not to one man, but to an entire army. He mocked their silence. He scorned their faith. He laughed at their courage. His words were heavy, not only with arrogance, but with power, the kind of power that breaks a man before a blade is even drawn. For 40 days he stood there. Each morning he stepped forward. Each morning he bellowed his challenge, and each morning no one answered. Not the strongest of Israel, not the boldest of its soldiers, not even the king himself. The challenge was simple, one man against another. Let the outcome decide the war. But the simplicity was an illusion, for who could look at Goliath and believe that any human hand could bring him down? Fear is not only a feeling, it is a chain, and those chains bound the Israelite camp. Even the bravest among them felt their strength slip away when the giant appeared. Men who had fought wars, men who had stood against arrows and blades, now lowered their eyes and turned away. Courage that once burned in their hearts now flickered like a dying flame. And with every day that passed, Goliath grew taller in their minds. That is the way of giants. Their power lies not only in their bodies, but in the legends they build. Each unanswered challenge added to his size. Each silent dawn made him greater than before. He no longer stood as one man. He stood as the weight of 40 days of silence, the embodiment of despair. The valley itself seemed to hold its breath. At night, when the fires burned low and the soldiers sat in uneasy silence, they whispered of him. Some spoke of his armor, how it covered him like the scales of a beast. Others told stories of his birth, that he was not truly human, but descended from ancient giants whose blood had never died out. There were even those who believed no weapon could pierce him, that he was marked by the gods themselves. Each whisper grew into certainty, and certainty fed fear. The sound of his laughter haunted them. When the Israelites rose in the morning, they knew what awaited them. They knew the giant would walk again, that his voice would thunder again, that their silence would shame them again. Day after day, it became a rhythm like the tolling of a great bell that measured out despair. Even the strongest arms cannot hold a sword steady when the heart is already defeated. And so the Valley of Elah was no longer only a battlefield. It was a prison of the spirit. Fear is a strange thing. It multiplies faster than courage. One man trembles, and another sees it and trembles more. Soon the whole camp was chained by the same weight. Men who once boasted of their victories could no longer lift their eyes toward the field. No one dared to dream of victory. The only dream was of survival. Across the valley, the Philistines grew bolder. With each day their champion returned unchallenged, their laughter rose. Their confidence swelled. For why should they fear an army that could not send even one man to answer? The war, in their eyes, was already won. All that remained was for Israel to break. But the Israelites could not retreat. Their honor chained them to the hills, just as fear chained them from battle. So they remained day after day, night after night, caught between shame and terror, unwilling to fight, unable to flee. The valley was no longer only a place on a map. It was a test of the soul. And in that test, Israel was failing. Even King Saul, taller than all his men, remained in silence. He had armor, he had weapons, he had the crown of a nation, but none of these could shield him from the dread that grew each day. If the king himself would not face the giant, how could any soldier dare? And so time passed, and with time, despair deepened. 40 days, 40 mornings of thunderous challenge, 40 evenings of silence and shame. The legend of Goliath was written not only in his size or his strength, but in those empty days. For a giant grows greater when no one dares to stand against him. His shadow stretches wider, his roar grows louder, and soon he becomes more than flesh. He becomes a force of nature, a storm that men believe cannot be broken. The Valley of Elah became a place of waiting, waiting for courage that never came, waiting for an answer that never rose, waiting for something, anything, that could shatter the chains of fear. For fear can only be broken by one thing, not by silence, not by waiting, but by a single act of courage that refuses to bow. The soldiers did not yet know it, but the valley that drained their hope would soon become the stage of a story that would echo through the ages. For every day that Goliath's shadow grew longer, every day that his voice thundered across the hills, the world drew closer to the moment when courage would rise from the most unlikely of places. The Valley of Fear was preparing for its answer. The Valley of Elah had grown used to silence. Each morning the giant's roar echoed, and each morning the soldiers of Israel remained frozen in fear. For 40 days, no man stepped forward. Courage withered like grass in the heat, and despair spread to the camp like a sickness. The men looked at their king, but even Saul did not rise. And then a boy appeared. He was not dressed in armor. He wore no sword at his side. His hands bore no scars of war. He carried with him only a staff, a sling, and a pouch. To the soldiers who saw him, he seemed out of place, almost laughable. For what use was a shepherd in a battlefield where giants walked? This boy was David, the youngest son of Jesse of Bethlehem. He had not come seeking glory, nor had he come to fight. He came because his father sent him to bring bread and grain to his older brothers. He came as a messenger, not as a warrior. Yet destiny often hides in the simplest errands, and sometimes the smallest figure carries the heaviest burden. David had spent his life among the hills, far from the roar of armies. His days were spent guiding sheep across rocky slopes, his nights watching the stars while the wind whispered through the grass. But the quiet life of a shepherd was not as peaceful as it seemed. Predators lurked in the shadows, wolves, bears, even lions. And when they came, David did not run. He stood between the beast and his flock, with nothing but his sling and his courage. He faced them down. He had dragged lambs from the jaws of lions. He had struck down bears with his own hands. His strength was not in size nor in steel, but in faith, the kind of faith that saw the impossible and believed it could fall. When David reached the camp, he expected to find men ready for battle. Instead, he found them silent, their courage broken by the voice of one man. He listened as Goliath's challenge thundered across the valley. He watched the soldiers lower their eyes as fear chained their feet, and something stirred within him. Anger not born of pride, but defiance. For to him, Goliath was not merely a giant of flesh. He was an insult against the living God. David asked the men around him, "Who is this that defies the armies of the living God?" His words shocked them. They mocked him for his youth, for his inexperience. To them, he was reckless, a child who did not understand war. But David's courage was not born from ignorance. It was born from trust, a trust that the same hand that had delivered him from lions and bears would deliver him from this giant. Word of his boldness spread through the camp until it reached the ears of King Saul. The king called for him, and David stood before the ruler of Israel. He was small compared to the warriors who filled the tents. His frame was lean, his face still young. To Saul, it seemed impossible that such a boy could face the terror that had silenced his army. But David spoke with a fire in his voice. "Your servant has kept his father's sheep. When the lion came, I struck it down. When the bear rose against me, I seized it and killed it. The same God who saved me from the paw of the lion and the bear will save me from this Philistine." It was not arrogance. It was certainty. Saul saw in him something he had not seen in any soldier for 40 days, faith unbroken by fear. Perhaps the king doubted, but he had no other choice. He gave David permission to face the giant. He even offered his own armor, the crown's own shield and sword. But when David tried them, they weighed him down. The boy removed them, piece by piece, until he stood once more as he had always been, a shepherd with staff, a sling, and a pouch of stones. The soldiers murmured. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others laughed, certain they were sending a lamb to slaughter. But David did not waver. His courage seemed almost reckless, yet within it lay the seed of destiny. For sometimes the greatest strength is not found in steel, but in faith. David walked out from the camp. The sunlight fell across his shoulders. The valley stretched before him, wide and silent. Across the field, the Philistines rose in laughter. They saw a boy stepping forward where men had refused. They saw no armor, no sword, no shield. They saw weakness, and they mocked it. Then Goliath appeared. His shadow stretched long across the valley. His armor shone like bronze fire. His spear gleamed, its tip catching the light like a star. His laughter shook the ground as he saw the boy. He bellowed with scorn, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" His voice rolled like thunder. He cursed David by the names of his gods. He swore to feed his flesh to the birds and beasts. But David did not tremble. He looked up at the giant and answered, not with fear, but with faith. His words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any sword. You come to me with sword and spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. Today he will deliver you into my hand. The air between them grew heavy, as if the valley itself held its breath. On one side stood Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, the descendant of giants, a man of bronze and terror. On the other stood David, a shepherd boy with nothing but stones in his pouch and faith in his heart. To the world, it seemed no contest. Yet the world often forgets that the smallest seed can break the hardest stone, and that courage, once unleashed, can topple even the tallest giant. David reached down and chose 5 smooth stones from a brook. He placed them in his pouch, his hands steady, his eyes fixed. Each stone carried with it not only weight, but hope, the hope of a people who had been silenced for 40 days. And as he stepped forward, the laughter of the Philistines turned to jeers. The murmurs of the Israelites turned to uneasy silence. The valley was no longer only a place of fear. It had become a place of destiny. For in that moment, the shepherd had arrived. He did not come with armor. He did not come with the strength of armies. He came with faith and with the courage to stand where others would not. And in that courage lay the answer to 40 days of silence. The shepherd had arrived, and with him, the shadow of the giant was about to be challenged. The valley was silent, though thousands stood upon its slopes. On one side, the Philistines waited with laughter still on their lips. On the other, the Israelites held their breath, their hearts pounding in fear and disbelief. Between them, 2 figures moved toward one another. 2 figures so different they seemed to come from separate worlds. One was a giant wrapped in bronze, his body glimmering in the sun, each step striking the earth like a hammer. His shield-bearer hurried ahead, but even the man carrying the shield seemed swallowed by the giant's presence. His spear rose like a towering beam of iron, his voice like thunder rolling through the hills. The other was a shepherd, slender and unarmored, carrying no sword, no shield, no spear. His only weapon was a sling, and in his pouch rested 5 stones gathered from a brook. His hands were steady, his eyes unbroken, and though his frame was small, something larger carried him forward. When David stepped into the open, the giant roared with laughter. His voice shook the ground, his words cutting through the air. Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? His insults poured like fire. His curses called upon the gods of Philistines. To him, this boy was no warrior. He was an insult, a child sent to mock his strength. The Philistines laughed with him. The Israelites trembled in shame. And yet David stood unmoved. His voice, though softer, carried across the valley with words that burned brighter than steel. You come to me with sword and spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. Today, he will deliver you into my hand. In that moment, bronze mocked leather, strength mocked simplicity, and yet the valley felt heavier, as though it knew this battle was larger than weapons. It was a clash of worlds. One world was a world of giants, of raw power, of flesh that towered, of bronze that blinded, of fear that silenced nations. The other was a world of faith, of unseen strength, of courage that defied reason, of hands steady enough to guide a stone where no sword could reach. The soldiers who watched felt the tension press upon their chests. Every heartbeat was heavy, every breath sharp. What chance could a shepherd boy have against a man who seemed carved from stone itself? Goliath advanced, his laughter replaced by rage. He raised a spear, its shadow falling long across the ground. The earth trembled beneath his stride. His armor creaked and clanged. His eyes burned with fury. He was a storm of flesh and iron, moving to crush the boy who dared stand before him. David moved as well, but not backward. He ran forward. His feet struck the earth with light steps. His hand dipped into his pouch. His sling curled through the air. The 2 figures drew closer, one heavy as a mountain, the other swift as a wind. The clash was not only of bodies, but of beliefs. To the Philistines, victory was certain. They trusted in size and weapons, in the weight of bronze. To the Israelites, despair still whispered in their hearts, but they saw a boy against a giant. But David carried something greater than fear or laughter. He carried faith, and faith does not measure the size of the enemy. The giant roared and lifted his spear. David's hand tightened around a stone. The sling began to spin, faster and faster, its whistle rising to the valley like the breath of a storm. The soldiers on both sides leaned forward, their hearts caught in their throats. Time seemed to slow. Bronze towered over leather. A mountain of strength loomed over a boy of faith. The world itself seemed to ask the question, what matters more? The weight of a man's body, or the fire of his spirit? The steel of a weapon, or the certainty of belief? This was not a battle of flesh alone. This was the test of two worlds colliding. David's sling spun in the air, his eyes fixed upon the giant's forehead. His breath was steady, his courage unbroken. With a single motion, he loosed a stone. It flew with speed no eye could follow, a blur against the sunlight, a whisper of defiance against a roar of terror. The valley watched as faith and power met in the space between. For a moment, nothing, and then the sound came, the crack of stone against flesh. The giant's laughter died. His eyes widened. His body swayed like a tower struck by lightning. The ground seemed to tremble as bronze toppled, the great frame of Goliath falling face first into the dust. Silence. The laughter of the Philistines vanished. The fear of the Israelites turned to shock. The valley itself seemed to hold its breath as the impossible became real. The giant, who had mocked armies for 40 days, who had walked as a nightmare across the earth, lay still upon the ground. The shepherd had stood against a world of giants, and the shepherd had not fallen. It was more than a victory. It was a revelation. For in that clash, the truth was revealed, that faith and courage can stand against even the greatest of powers, that simplicity can undo strength, that belief can break chains of fear that weapons cannot. The two worlds had collided, and the world of faith had not only survived, it had triumphed. The soldiers of Israel stood in stunned silence. Their eyes turned from the fallen giant to the boy who had slain him, and in that silence, hope stirred like fire in dry grass. The Philistines saw their champion broken, and terror gripped their hearts. For their giant could fall, what power did they truly hold? The clash of worlds had ended with the most unlikely of victories. The shepherd had struck down the giant, and the story of that moment would echo through time. But for those who stood in the valley that day, it was more than a story. It was a reminder that no shadow, no voice, no enemy is too great when courage dares to rise. The clash of flesh and spirit, of bronze and stone, of power and faith, had been decided, and the valley, once ruled by fear, now belonged to the shepherd who had dared to believe. The valley held its breath. Thousands of eyes were fixed upon two figures standing across from one another. One was vast, his armor gleaming, his spear glistening like the branch of a great tree. The other was small, dressed in nothing but the simple garb of a shepherd. Between them stretched the space of destiny, a space that had waited 40 days for this single moment. David's hand moved slowly toward his pouch. His fingers brushed against the stones he had gathered from a brook, smooth, round, chosen with care. Each stone was small enough to be overlooked, yet strong enough to break what seemed unbreakable. His hand lingered, then closed around one. He lifted it, feeling its weight in his palm, as though testing whether the earth itself approved of his choice. The Philistines laughed. The Israelites trembled, and yet David's heart was steady. He placed a stone into the sling. His other hand tightened upon the cord. The boy who had once guarded sheep from predators now stood guarding a nation from despair. The same skill that had brought down lions and bears was about to be tested against a giant whose very name sent fear through armies. The sling began to whirl. At first it was slow, the stone circling like a quiet whisper. Then faster, the air catching its rhythm, the cord slicing the wind. The sound rose, low at first, then sharp, a whistle that seemed to cut through silence itself. The giant moved forward, his laughter booming like thunder. His spear gleamed, his armor rattled. His shadow stretched long across the ground. But David's eyes did not waver. The sling spun faster, a blur in the sunlight. His feet planted firm, his arms steady, his faith unbroken. In that moment, there was no army, no valley, no laughter, no fear. There was only the boy, the sling, the stone, and the giant who stood before him. Then David loosed his hand. The cord snapped open and the stone flew. It left the sling with a speed unseen by the human eye, cutting through the air like lightning in the storm. It was faster than any arrow, sharper than any blade. The air seemed to part before it, as though unseen hands guided its path. Soldiers on both sides leaned forward, straining to follow its flight, but the stone was quicker than thought itself. And then, impact. The sound was not loud, but sharp, a crack like stone striking stone. The giant's forehead split where the stone struck, the single place unguarded by bronze. His laughter ended in silence. His eyes widened with shock. The great frame that had towered so proudly began to sway. For a moment, the world itself seemed to pause. Then the giant fell. He crashed forward, his body striking the earth with a force that shook the valley. Bronze clanged against rock. Dust burst upward in clouds, and the earth trembled as though a mountain had collapsed. The man who had mocked armies, who had stood untouchable for 40 days, now lay face down in the dust. Silence. The Philistines stared in disbelief. Their laughter choked in their throats. The Israelites stood frozen, unable to trust their eyes. For in that moment, the impossible had become real. The shepherd boy had slain the giant. It was not a sword that struck him down, nor a spear, nor the strength of many men. It was a single stone, guided by a sling, loosed by a hand steady with faith. The small had overcome the mighty. The weak had broken the strong. The forgotten had defeated the feared. The valley that had once echoed with the roar of the giant now stood in silence before the power of something greater than size, greater than armor, greater than fear itself. David lowered his sling, his breast steady, his eyes unshaken. He walked toward the fallen giant. Each step carried not pride, but certainty. He stood over the body of Goliath, towering now not by size, but by victory. He lifted the giant's own sword, so heavy it seemed impossible for one so small to carry. With a single motion, he cut off the head of the Philistine champion. The sight broke the silence. The Israelites roared with triumph. Their fear, chained for 40 days, shattered in an instant. Hope surged like fire, and courage swept through their ranks. Across the valley, the Philistines turned in terror. The invincible giant was no more. Their champion had fallen, and with him, their pride. Panic seized them, and they fled. But the story was larger than a single victory. The stone in flight was more than a weapon. It was a message that giants, no matter how great, are not beyond defeat. That faith can strike where steel cannot reach. That courage can rise where fear has reigned too long. The stone was not simply flung by the hand of a shepherd. It carried with it the weight of a nation's hope, the answer to 40 days of silence, the proof that even the smallest among men can bring down the mightiest. For generations, people would remember the clash of David and Goliath. But even more than the clash, they would remember the stone. That small, simple stone that flew faster than arrows, struck truer than swords, and brought down a mountain of flesh. Legends are not born only from victories. They are born from moments when the impossible is broken. The stone in flight was such a moment. It transformed the shepherd into a hero, the boy into a warrior, the forgotten into the remembered. And though the giant lay silent in the dust, his shadow did not vanish. It lived on in the story, in the memory, in the lesson that would echo across ages. The fall of Goliath was not the end of giants, but the reminder that no giant, whether of flesh or fear or power, is invincible. The stone flew, the giant fell, and the world learned once more that the strength of faith can topple the strongest of men. And so the valley, once ruled by fear, became the ground of hope. The shepherd had stood, the stone had flown, the giant had fallen. The story was no longer about the size of Goliath, but about the courage of David, and the stone that carried faith into the heart of the impossible. The valley shook with the sound of silence. The roar of Goliath had ended, and where his voice once filled the air, now there was only dust rising from his fallen frame. The giant who had mocked nations, who had stood untouchable for 40 days, now lay motionless in the dirt. His bronze armor no longer gleamed in pride. It lay scattered and dull upon the earth, powerless. The Philistines watched in horror. Their champion, their living wall of flesh and iron, the man they believed invincible, was dead. His defeat shattered more than a body. It shattered the illusion that giants could not fall. Fear, which they had cast upon Israel, now came rushing back upon their own hearts. The army broke. Shouts of panic spread like wildfire. The Philistines turned to flee, their banners dropping, their weapons abandoned, their courage gone. For Goliath could be slain by a shepherd boy. What strength remained for them? Their God had failed. Their giant had fallen, and the tide of battle turned against them in a single heartbeat. The Israelites, once chained by fear, now surged forward. Their voices rose in a roar that shook the hills. Courage, long buried under silence, returned to flood. They chased the Philistines from the valley, striking them down along the road, scattering them across the plains. But the true victory was not measured in the number of enemies slain. It was measured in the breaking of belief. The belief that giants could not be defeated. The fall of Goliath became more than a battlefield memory. It became a legend, a story whispered around fires, carried through villages, sung in triumph, and told to children as proof that no giant is too great to fall. The shepherd's stone was remembered not as a weapon, but as a symbol of courage against the impossible. Yet with the hope came something else, questions. If one giant could fall, what the others? The world had always whispered of giants. From the Anakim who once ruled the highlands, to the Rephaim spoken of in ancient scrolls, to the Nephilim of old, beings born of strange unions, taller and stronger than men. For generations they had loomed in stories, half remembered, half feared. Goliath had seemed to prove that such tales were not mere myths. His size, his strength, his very presence echoed those ancient memories. But now he was gone, and with his fall, whispers spread. If David, a boy with a sling, could strike down such a figure, then perhaps the age of giants was ending. Perhaps their shadow was lifting from the world. Or perhaps their fall carried a deeper mystery. For legends tell that Goliath was not alone. In the land of the Philistines were others of his kind. His brothers, men of great size, warriors whose spears were as heavy as beams. Some said entire bloodlines of giants remained, hidden in distant cities, ruling from shadows, waiting for their time to rise again. Others believed their numbers had dwindled, each defeat marking the fading of a race that once towered over humanity. The death of Goliath raised more questions than it answered. Who were these beings truly? Descendants of men with unusual strength, or remnants of something far older? Creatures born in the days when heaven and earth had mingled? Were they champions of flesh alone, or were they echoes of a forgotten age? The people did not know, but they told the story anyway. They spoke of the boy who had walked into the valley without armor, carrying only faith. They spoke of the stone that flew truer than arrows, fastened spears, cutting to the giant's pride and striking his fall. They spoke of how terror turned to dust, how courage returned, how a nation was saved by the smallest among them. Hope filled the land, but along with hope, or remained, for though the giant was gone, his shadow lingered in memory. Children asked their fathers what giants were, and fathers spoke of the old days, when the land was said to be filled with them. Travelers told tales of bones buried in caves, of weapons too large for men to lift, of ruins that only hands larger than human could have built. Each story added to the mystery, each whisper carrying the sense that Goliath was but one piece of something greater. The fall of giants was not only the breaking of fear, it was a stirring of wonder. David became the symbol of triumph, but Goliath became the question that refused to die. If one giant had lived among men in those days, how many more had there been? How many still remained, hidden in distant mountains or buried beneath forgotten earth? The story spread far beyond Israel. Traders carried it across the seas. Kings heard it in their halls. Storytellers wove it into their songs. And with each telling, the legend grew. It was no longer only about a boy and a giant. It became the eternal reminder that the mighty can fall, that courage can rise, that faith can stand where fear once ruled. And yet, the deeper mystery endured. What were the origins of such beings? Could their blood still flow in hidden lines, waiting to awaken again? Were they the same giants remembered in the myths of Greece? The Titans who once battled the gods? Were they the Jotun of the north, the Fomorians of the west, The great beings remembered across every land? Why did every culture recall giants, as though humanity itself could not forget them? Goliath's fall was not only the end of a man, it was the reawakening of ancient memory. For in his defeat, the veil lifted for a moment, and the world glimpsed the truth that giants had walked the earth, and perhaps their shadows had never truly vanished. The hope born from his fall was strong, but the mystery it left behind was stronger still. The shepherd had slain the giant, but the question remained, was Goliath the last or merely the most famous? And so the tale spread, carried from voice to voice, from age to age. The fall of Goliath was a fall of fear, the rise of courage, and a reminder that even the greatest shadows can be broken. But it was also the story that kept alive the oldest wonder of mankind. Who were the giants, and what became of them? The fall of giants was more than history. It was the beginning of a legend that would never die. The fall of Goliath did not end the memory of giants. Instead, it lit a fire that spread beyond the borders of Israel, a question that stretched across oceans and mountains were giants only here, or had they walked in every land beneath the sky? Stories whispered of them everywhere, from the icy peaks of the north to the green valleys of the west, from the temples of Greece to the forests of distant lands. Tales arose of beings far too large for ordinary men to challenge. They lived in myth and legend in the half-remembered songs of old, but their shadows seemed too great, too universal, to be dismissed as simple invention. Could Goliath have been one of many, a fragment of a brotherhood of giants remembered in every corner of the world? In the north, where the air was sharp and the winters long, the Norse people spoke of the Jotun. These were not ordinary men, but beings vast as mountains, creatures of frost and fire, locked in eternal struggle with the gods themselves. They were said to hurl boulders across valleys, to stride across rivers in a single step, to shape the very land with their battles. The sagas tell of Thor, the thunder god, who lifted his hammer against them, bringing storms to shatter their might. To the Norse, giants were not a memory. They were a force of nature, as real as the sea or the sky. Far to the west, across mist-covered waters, the Irish told of the Fomorians. They were beings of chaos, rising from the sea to wage war upon the first peoples of Ireland. Some were said to have only one eye or one arm, or one leg, yet their strength was beyond measure. They clashed with the Tuatha Dé Danann, a race of godlike beings who became the heroes of Ireland. In those battles, the land itself was torn and shaped, hills and valleys forming where giants struck one another down. Even now, in Ireland's countryside, great stones lie scattered as though left by hands too large for humankind. The Greeks remembered the Titans. Ancient, vast, and powerful, they were the children of the sky and the earth, older than the gods of Olympus. They ruled the world before Zeus rose against them, casting them into the depths of Tartarus. But though they were chained, their memory was never lost. The Greeks told how the earth itself shook when the giants of the old age fought the gods. Mountains were thrown, seas boiled, thunder split the heavens. To them, giants were not only beings of flesh, but symbols of the raw power of creation itself. Across the oceans, other tales grew. The native peoples of North America told of enormous beings who walked the plains and hunted men. Some spoke of red-haired giants in caves. Others of colossal spirits who left footprints larger than a man's body in the land of the Pacific. Islanders spoke of builders so tall they could lift stones that no modern crane could move. The ruins of their temples, their great stone statues, still stand, raising questions of whether giant hands once shaped them. Everywhere, the story was the same. Different names, different shapes, different battles. But always the same memory of beings larger than men, too strong to fight, too ancient to ignore. Why did every culture remember them? Was it only imagination, the mind of mankind weaving fear into tales of monsters? Or was it memory, passed down through generations, of a time when such beings truly walked the earth? Goliath's fall became part of this puzzle. His size, his strength, his very existence seemed to confirm what so many stories across the world had already whispered. That giants were not only myth, that they were real, and that they had ruled in ages past. His defeat at the hands of shepherd gave hope to men, but it also stirred awe and suspicion. If Goliath lived, then perhaps the Jotun, The Fomorians, the Titans, and the Nephilim were not only tales, but pieces of a truth scattered across the earth. Perhaps these stories were not born from fear alone, but from memory of encounters long ago, passed from father to son, from elder to child, reshaped by time but never forgotten. And the earth itself carries strange reminders. In mountains and caves, massive bones have been uncovered, some too large to belong to any man. Ancient weapons, rusted and broken, seem designed for hands greater than human. Megalithic stones, carved and lifted into impossible shapes, raise the question of who had the strength to place them. Were these the works of ordinary men, or were they the last fingerprints of giants? David's victory over Goliath was not the end of a single duel. It was the opening of a mystery that reached across the world. For if one shepherd boy could bring down a giant in Israel, then what of countless other stories? Could there have been many Goliaths spread across the earth, remembered in different tongues, given different names, but sharing the same fate? The world seemed bound together by the memory of giants. Each people carried their own, each tale pointing to an age when man was not the only master of the earth. And though the details changed, one truth lingered: the giants always fell, whether struck down by gods in Greece, by heroes in Ireland, by thunder in the north, or by a shepherd in Israel. Their reign always ended in defeat. Was this the destiny of all giants? To rise in terror, to rule for a time, and then to fall before the courage of those smaller than themselves? The answer was never clear, but the pattern was there. The fall of Goliath was not only a triumph of faith over fear. It was part of something larger, part of a story told by the whole world. His death was not only Israel's victory, but humanity's memory. For in him, the echo of every giant seemed to rise once more, only to be silenced by the hand of the small. And yet the question endures. Were giants only misshaped by the fears of ancient men, or were they real creatures whose bones lie hidden beneath the earth, whose ruins stand unrecognized, whose stories still echo in every land? The shepherd's stone reminds us that giants can fall, but the legends across the world remind us that giants once stood, and together, these stories leave us with a mystery too great to ignore. For giants truly lived everywhere. Then perhaps their shadows still linger, waiting to be uncovered in forgotten corners of the earth. The giant had fallen, yet his shadow did not vanish. Goliath's death ended a battle, but it began a mystery. His name did not sink into silence. It grew into a question that has echoed for centuries. What was he truly? A man of unusual size, or a remnant of something older, something greater, something that linked him to the forgotten giants of the world? Some ancient texts whisper that Goliath was not only a Philistine warrior. They say his people were the last descendants of Nephilim, beings described as the offspring of gods and mortals, a union of the heavenly and the earthly. These beings were said to be mighty men of old, beings whose strength and stature towered over mankind. If Goliath was one of them, his story was not only about war, it was about bloodlines that carried a mystery deeper than history itself. Others point to the Rephaim, the Anakim, or other tribes spoken of in the old scrolls, races of giants driven into the shadows, yet never fully erased. The Philistine city of Gath, where Goliath was born, was known as a stronghold of such beings. Some texts mention his brothers, also men of unusual size, warriors whose weapons were too heavy for ordinary men to lift. One was said to wield a spear with a shaft like a weaver's beam. Another bore 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. These strange details, preserved in ancient memory, leave behind the impression of a family unlike any other. But were they human or something more? The mystery deepens when we turn to the earth itself. Across the world, archaeologists and explorers have unearthed bones that seem too large to belong to ordinary men. Legends speak of skeletons discovered in caves, their skulls broad, their femurs long, their size towering above the frame of a modern soldier. Massive weapons, rusted and broken, have been found buried in forgotten soils, blades and spears that no normal hand could wield. Ancient walls built with stones too heavy to move by simple tools still rise in silence, as though waiting for us to ask the question: were these the fingerprints of giants? In some lands, farmers claim to dig up skulls the size of barrels. In others, explorers told of femurs longer than a man's arm. Reports from centuries past describe burial mounds that reveal bones far larger than any ordinary grave. While many of these discoveries have been lost, dismissed, or hidden, the whispers remain. They feed the suspicion that the giants of legend were not simply imagination. If Goliath's bloodline reached back to such beings, then his fall was not the end of a man. It was the ending of an ancient race. Yet history tells us his kind may not have vanished at once. The old scrolls record battles not only against Goliath, but against his kin. David himself, later in life, faced other giants of Gath. His men fought and slew them, one by one, until their memory faded into silence. Was this the slow extinction of a bloodline that had once ruled the land? Or was it the deliberate erasing of something humanity was never meant to remember? The mystery of Goliath's bloodline is not only about bones and battles. It is about the very nature of giants. Were they natural? Were they born of men, simply larger than the rest? Or were they the offspring of something beyond human? The Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim. These names carry with them the weight of strangeness, of a people not fully like us. If they were real, where did they come from? Some believe they were born from the union of divine beings and mortals. Their strength and size a mark of their unnatural birth. Others claim they were simply men who grew taller and stronger in an ancient age, when the earth was different, when lifespans stretched longer and bodies grew larger. Still others argue they were symbols, not flesh. Stories meant to embody human fears of the impossible. But then there is Goliath. He was not a distant myth told in foreign lands. He was not a titan chained in Tartarus, nor a Fomorian hidden in Irish seas. He was a man who stood in a valley, mocked an army, and fell to a stone. His presence in history makes the question unavoidable. If he lived, if his body walked the earth, then perhaps the blood of giants was not entirely legend. What became of his kind? Did they all perish in battles long forgotten? Were they hunted down until none remained? Or do their bones lie buried under mountains, waiting to be uncovered? Some whisper that traces of their bloodline still linger in humanity, hidden in unusual height, in strength that defies reason, in the anomalies that remind us the past is never fully gone. Others believe their fall was final, their race erased by time, leaving only shadows and story. And yet, even in their fall, they refuse to be forgotten. The story of Goliath is told again and again, not only because of the shepherd who slew him, but because of what he represented. He was the last great shadow of an age when giants walked the earth. His fall was not only a triumph, it was a reminder that the world was once different, that humanity once lived under the gaze of beings too large to ignore, too strong to fight, too strange to explain. The eternal question remains, were they real? If they were, then Goliath was a remnant, a survivor of a bloodline that had stretched back to the dawn of man. His death was the closing of a chapter older than history. If they were not, then why do so many stories across the world, in every tongue, remember them? Why do the ruins, the stones, the bones all seem to whisper their name? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between legend and memory. Perhaps giants lived, but in forms we cannot fully understand. Perhaps they were both men and more than men, both flesh and myth, both real and yet large in reality itself. The shepherd's stone ended one life, but it did not end the questions. The mystery of Goliath's bloodline endures, calling us to wonder whether the earth once bore children too great for time to preserve. And until the last ruin is explored, until the last bone is unearthed, until the last whisper is silenced, the shadow of giants will remain. The battlefield lay silent after clash. The dust still hung in the air, carrying with it the memory of a moment that would never be forgotten. Where once the roar of Goliath had shaken the earth, there was now only the echo of his fall. His body, mighty and armored, lay motionless upon the ground, and beside him stood the shepherd who had dared to believe. David had come to the valley as a boy. He left it as something far greater. His sling still hung at his side, his hand still callous from tending sheep. But his name had already risen beyond the hills of Bethlehem. In that single act of courage, he stepped out of obscurity and into destiny. No longer was he simply the youngest son of Jesse. No longer was he the boy sent with bread to his brothers. He was now the shepherd who faced the terror of nations and did not break. His courage had lifted a people from despair. His stone had broken the illusion of invincibility, and his faith had carried him into the heart of history. The Israelites rejoiced, their voices rolling across the hills in triumph. For 40 days they had lived in the shadow of fear, and in one moment it had been shattered. The Philistines fled, their confidence scattered, their pride broken. The power of a giant had fallen into the hand of a boy, and with it, the balance of belief had changed. But Goliath's shadow did not vanish with his body. His name lived on, not only as a memory of defeat, but as the image of impossible odds. Across the years, across the lands, the story spread. It was retold in homes and courts, sung in poems and prayers, whispered to children as they drifted to sleep. David versus Goliath became more than a tale. It became a symbol, a language of its own. Whenever the small stood against the mighty, whenever the weak challenged the strong, the world remembered the shepherd and the giant. David's life did not end in that valley. It only began. He would rise from shepherd to warrior, from warrior to leader, from leader to king. His reign would carry victories and failures, triumphs and sorrows. But through it all, one memory would never fade. The day he stood before a giant and proved that fear can be broken. The legacy of the giant slayer was not written only in victories on the battlefield. It was written in the hearts of those who heard his story. For within every person, in every age, there are giants. Giants of fear, giants of doubt, giants of despair, giants that loom larger than life itself. The story of David endures because it tells not only of one shepherd boy, but of the human spirit. It speaks of the truth that no giant, however great, is beyond defeat. This is why the story has lived for centuries, surviving wars, empires, and kingdoms. It is told in churches, in homes, in schools, in songs, and even in the language of daily life. When the world speaks of David versus Goliath, it speaks of the eternal hope that the small can overcome the mighty, that courage can rise against terror, that belief can strike where weapons cannot. But the story is more than comfort. It is also a mystery. For while David rose, Goliath's shadow never left. His bloodline, his origins, his size, his strength, all remain questions that stir the imagination. Was he the last in the Nephilim, a remnant of ancient beings who once walked among men? Was he a warrior of unusual size, his legend grown by fear and memory? Or was he both, a man and a myth, caught between flesh and story, leaving behind a riddle that has never been solved? The fall of Goliath reminds us of two truths. One, that giants can be slain. Two, that giants will always return in some form, whether in the flesh of men, the challenges of life, or the fears of the heart. And so the tale endures, carried not only as history, but as prophecy. Every generation retells it, because every generation needs it. The world will always have giants, unshakable forces, towering fears, impossible odds. And the world will always need the reminder that giants are not invincible, that sometimes the smallest hand, guided by courage, can topple the tallest shadow. The shepherd's sling is gone. The giant's armor lies in the dust of forgotten time. But the lesson has never faded. David rose from that battlefield not as a shepherd, but as a hero destined to be king. Goliath fell, but his shadow never vanished. His name became the symbol of unbeatable odds, and David became the image of faith that conquers fear. Even now, thousands of years later, the words David versus Goliath carry power. They are spoken in courts, in arenas, in struggles of nations, in personal battles fought in silence. They remind us that no matter how large the enemy, no matter how strong the shadow, courage can strike a stone into its heart. Perhaps that is why the story lives on. Not because it is ancient, but because it is eternal. Because within every life there are valleys of Elah, moments when fear mocks us, when giants stand tall and roar. And within every heart, there lies the seed of a shepherd's courage, waiting to rise. The story of David and Goliath is not only about a boy and a giant. It is about the human spirit, about the truth that courage, once born, can break even the mightiest chains. Giants may fade from the earth, but their shadows remain in our stories, our fears, and our triumphs. And in those shadows, the legacy of the giant slayer still shines. This was David versus Goliath, the iconic giant slayer. Legends such as these remind us that while giants may pass into dust, Their echoes remain in the tales we tell. If this story moved you, share it with others who seek the courage to face their own giants. Like this video if the story inspired you. Subscribe to Lost Giants to continue the journey into myths, legends, and mysteries the world has almost forgotten, and together, we will keep the shadows alive.